We're told humanity emerged gradually through random evolution, ascending from primitive simplicity to complex civilization over hundreds of thousands of years. But the oldest written records on Earth tell a completely different story. The Atrahasis epic, preserved in Akkadian cuneiform and dating back nearly 4,000 years, describes human creation not as a divine blessing, but as a biological engineering project designed to solve a labor shortage. And according to these ancient texts, something went catastrophically wrong. The creation developed traits its designers never intended: the capacity for explosive reproduction, and more disturbing, the spark of rebellious consciousness inherited from a slain god's genetic material. When the Anunnaki realized their workers possessed intelligence and self-awareness that could rival their own, the texts describe their reaction in striking terms: terror, followed by systematic attempts to exterminate their own creation. What kind of flaw could drive advanced beings to deploy plagues, famines, and ultimately a global flood against the species they had engineered? And if these tablets preserve actual events rather than mythology, are the limitations built into humanity after that catastrophe, our mortality, our suffering, our vulnerability, still functioning today as intended control mechanisms? The Atrahasis epic doesn't begin with humanity. It begins 3,600 years earlier with a crisis among the gods themselves. The junior deities, known as the Igigi, had been assigned the brutal task of excavating the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, digging irrigation channels, and maintaining the infrastructure of the Anunnaki's Mesopotamian operations. For 36 centuries they labored. Then, according to Tablet 1, they reached their breaking point. The text records their revolt in specific terms. They burned their tools, surrounded the house of Enlil, the commander of Earth operations, and declared their intention to fight for their rights. This wasn't a minor dispute. The Igigi threatened to kill Enlil's chamberlain and refused to continue working. Enlil summoned the council of senior Anunnaki, including his brother Enki and the father figure Anu, to address what had become a full labor crisis. They needed workers to continue their projects, but the existing workforce had collapsed into open rebellion. Enki, described consistently in Sumerian and Akkadian texts as the scientist and engineer among the Anunnaki, proposed a solution that would reshape Earth's history. He suggested creating a new category of being, a Lulu Amelu, meaning mixed man or primitive worker, specifically designed to bear the workload the Igigi refused to carry. The mother goddess Mami, also called Ninhursag, or Nintu, depending on the text, would direct the biological creation process. Enki's proposal was accepted. This was not about creating life for philosophical or spiritual reasons. The text is explicit about function and purpose. Let this new being bear the yoke. Let it carry the load of the gods. Let it free the Igigi from their labor. Humanity, according to this record, was conceived as a biological tool. Engineered workers meant to serve a specific economic function in the Anunnaki hierarchy. The creation procedure described in the Atrahasis epic reads less like divine mystery and more like a laboratory protocol. Mami, the genetic engineer tasked with the project, required specific materials. She instructed the Anunnaki to slaughter one of their own kind and extract his biological essence. The text names him Geshtu-i, described as a god who had intelligence. The Akkadian word used is temu, meaning rationality, understanding, the capacity for complex thought. But Geshtu-i wasn't selected randomly from the Anunnaki ranks. The text identifies him as one of the Igigi rebels, possibly a leader among those who had burned their tools and surrounded Enlil's temple demanding freedom. His blood and flesh were mixed with clay, and according to Tablet 1, Mami declared that she was binding his Atemu, his spirit, his essence, into the new creation so that the living would remember the slain god. This detail appears deliberately emphasized in multiple versions of the text. 14 birth goddesses were assembled to carry the first generation of prototypes, 7 male and 7 female. After the gestation period, the first humans emerged. They functioned exactly as designed, taking over the agricultural labor, the canal digging, the maintenance work the Igigi had abandoned. For the Anunnaki leadership, the project appeared successful. But the texts contain a critical detail that suggests Enki may have understood something his fellow Anunnaki did not. By incorporating Gesh-2E's biological material, specifically choosing a rebel god who possessed advanced intelligence and the will to defy authority, the creators had installed more than just functional DNA. They had embedded consciousness, self-awareness, and the genetic memory of resistance itself. Whether this was Enki's intentional gift to humanity or an unforeseen consequence of the engineering process, the result would become apparent within 12 centuries. The Anunnaki had created workers, but they had inadvertently created something far more dangerous. Beings capable of independent thought, bearing the inherited spirit of a god who had died fighting for his freedom. The Atrahasis epic records that 1,200 years after the first generation emerged, Enlil convened an emergency assembly. The text describes his complaint with unusual specificity. The land became wide, the people became numerous, the land was bellowing like a bull. This wasn't poetry celebrating human prosperity. Tablet 2 preserves Enlil's exact grievance. The noise of humanity had become intolerable, disturbing his rest and overwhelming the established order. What the Anunnaki leadership confronted was exponential population growth far exceeding their original specifications. They had designed a workforce, but they hadn't installed reproductive limits. The biological imperative to multiply, combined with the robust physical template Mami had engineered, produced something the texts describe with alarm. Humans were spreading across regions, establishing communities, generating activity and presence that filled the landscape. The Akkadian term translated as noise carries broader meaning than sound alone. It encompasses disorder, chaos, the disruption of controlled systems. Enlil's reaction reveals the fundamental miscalculation. The Anunnaki had succeeded in creating durable, efficient workers, but they had failed to anticipate that biological success would generate its own momentum. Each generation produced more workers than needed, and those workers continued producing beyond economic utility. The creation was functioning, but it was functioning too well, replicating beyond the parameters that would keep it manageable and contained. More disturbing than sheer numbers was what accompanied them. The text described communities forming, human activity intensifying, the species establishing its own patterns rather than simply responding to Anunnaki direction. This suggested the second flaw embedded in the design. The intelligence inherited from Gesh-2E wasn't passive. It was generative, creating culture, organization, perhaps even the earliest signs of independent civilization. For Enlil, this represented a control system failure. His creation was no longer responding as a managed resource. It was behaving as a competing presence on Earth, and the trajectory pointed towards something the Commander God found unacceptable, a creation that might eventually challenge its creators. Enlil's first intervention wasn't the flood. According to Tablet 2 of the Atrahasis epic, he deployed what the text describes as systematic reduction protocols, plagues, drought, famine, each designed to restore population equilibrium without completely destroying the workforce. The text records his instruction to the divine assembly with technical precision. He commanded Namtar, the plague god, to release disease among humanity. This should have worked. A targeted pathogen reducing numbers to sustainable levels, leaving survivors to continue their labor function. But Enki, who had engineered humanity in the first place, intervened. He approached the human Atrahasis, whose name means extremely wise, and provided specific counter-instructions. The text describes Atrahasis organizing offerings to Namtar and the plague withdrawing. Enlil's second attempt involved cutting off rain, withholding water, creating famine conditions across multiple years. Again, the text records Enki's covert interference, advising Atrahasis on measures that broke the drought cycle. Then Enlil escalated. He locked the cosmic sources of food, preventing fish from rising in the sea, crops from growing in fields, implementing what reads as comprehensive resource denial. For 6 years, the text says, humanity faced extinction-level starvation, yet somehow, with Enki's continued guidance, enough survived that Enlil's objective failed. What these passages reveal isn't divine caprice. They document a fundamental split among the Anunnaki themselves regarding their creation. Enlil, the project commander, had concluded the design was flawed beyond repair and required termination. Enki, the chief scientist, either couldn't accept his creation's failure or recognize something in humanity worth preserving despite its unintended characteristics. This wasn't God versus humanity. This was creator versus creator, with humans caught between competing assessments of whether the Gesh-2E experiment should continue. When 3 successive population control measures failed due to Enki's sabotage, Enlil convened the council with a final proposal. The text records his demand that all Anunnaki swear a binding oath, and critically, that they specifically prevent Enki from warning humans about what was coming next. The patches had failed. Enlil was initiating complete system reset. Tablet 3 of the Atrahasis epic describes Enlil's final decision with language that suggests not divine judgment but engineering protocol. He commanded the Anunnaki assembly to swear an oath of absolute secrecy, binding even Enki to silence, and then announced the deployment of what the text calls the Abubu, the deluge, a flood designed to sterilize Earth's surface completely. This wasn't punishment for human sin or moral failing. The text contains no accusations of wickedness, no crimes listed, no ethical violations specified. Enlil's stated reason remained consistent with his earlier complaints. The noise, the numbers, the uncontrollable expansion of a creation that had exceeded its design parameters. The flood was the ultimate factory reset, a total elimination protocol when partial measures had failed. What makes the Akkadian account particularly revealing is the reaction it records among the Anunnaki themselves. When the waters rose, the gods, according to both Atrahasis and the parallel account in Tablet 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh, cowered like dogs, retreating to the highest heaven. The goddess Ishtar cried out in regret, lamenting that she had agreed to this destruction, watching the old days turn to clay. Even Enlil's fellow creators, who had voted to approve the flood, were horrified by the actual implementation. The text describes them weeping, overcome by what they were witnessing. This was not the response of confident engineers shutting down a failed machine. This was panic, remorse, perhaps the recognition that they had unleashed something beyond their ability to fully control. The flood's scope exceeded even their expectations. 7 days and 7 nights, the text records, with waters covering everything, erasing all human presence from Earth's surface. Yet Enki had broken his oath. He couldn't directly warn Atrahasis, so according to the text, he spoke to the wall of the man's reed house, knowing the human would overhear. He provided precise construction specifications for a boat, dimensions and waterproofing instructions, the amount of pitch needed, the categories of life to bring aboard. When the waters receded and Atrahasis emerged to offer sacrifice, Enlil's rage at discovering survivors tells us everything about his original intent. This wasn't meant to be a partial culling. The protocol called for complete extinction, total eradication of the flawed prototype. The survival of even one human family represented, from Enlil's perspective, mission failure. The mistake still existed, still carried Gesh-2E's rebel intelligence, still possessed the capacity to multiply and disturb the order he demanded. The confrontation between Enlil and Enki after the flood forced a compromise that would permanently reshape humanity's condition. Tablet 3 records Enlil's fury at discovering survivors, but Enki defended his decision with an argument the council accepted. Humanity remained useful, and complete extermination had proven both impossible and wasteful. The solution they engineered wasn't mercy, it was redesign. If the original model's flaw was uncontrolled replication and excessive vitality, then the post-flood version would have those capabilities permanently restricted. The text preserves the specific limitations imposed by the mother goddess Nintu, working with Enki's guidance. She decrees that among the peoples there are to be women who bear and women who do not bear. This wasn't natural variation. It was deliberate installation of infertility into the human genome. The text continues with additional constraints. Classes of women forbidden from childbirth. Demons assigned to snatch infants from mothers. High rates of mortality installed into childhood itself. These weren't curses or punishments. They were engineering specifications for Humanity 2.0, features designed to prevent the exponential growth that had triggered Enlil's extermination attempt. The texts from this period also reflect a dramatic reduction in human lifespan compared to antediluvian figures, though the mechanism isn't explicitly detailed. What the Anunnaki created after the flood was a controlled version of their original design, still functional as workers, still capable of reproduction, but operating under permanent biological governors that would prevent the population from ever again reaching levels that disturbed their creators. Could these restrictions still function today as intended? If the Akkadian tablets preserve actual events rather than mythology, then our mortality, our vulnerability to disease, our struggles with infertility, the suffering we accept as natural conditions of existence, all of it might be exactly what Nintu engineered into our species 4,000 years ago. Not flaws in creation, but features installed deliberately. The Anunnaki allowed their mistake to survive, but only after ensuring we would never again possess the vitality to challenge them. We inherited Geshtu-E's rebel consciousness, but we carry it in bodies specifically designed to fail. The Atrahasis epic forces a question that most interpretations of human origins never address. What if our creation story isn't about love, purpose, or divine intention, but about utility that backfired? The texts describe beings who needed workers, engineered a biological solution, then watched in mounting alarm as their creation developed capacities they never authorized. We carry the genetic memory of Geshtu-E, the rebel god whose intelligence and defiance were literally mixed into our prototype. That inheritance, our ability to question, to organize, to resist authority, to multiply beyond control, terrified our creators enough to attempt complete extermination. But we survived, damaged, limited, installed with biological restrictions designed to prevent us from ever again reaching the vitality that disturbed Enlil's order, yet still carrying that spark of consciousness that was never supposed to exist in a worker species. The Anunnaki's mistake wasn't in their engineering technique. Their mistake was assuming that intelligence could be bound without consequence, that spirit could be copied without transferring the will that animated it. If these tablets are records rather than myths, then every limitation we experience, mortality, disease, the suffering we accept as inevitable, may be exactly what Nintu specified when she redesigned our species after the flood. Not random features of biology, but deliberate constraints installed to ensure their flawed creation would never again grow powerful enough to challenge its designers. Which leads to the question the texts themselves leave unanswered. Did the control mechanisms work? Are we still operating within the parameters the Anunnaki installed 4 millennia ago? Or has Geshtu-E's rebel spirit found ways to transcend the biological governors meant to contain it? Our cities now generate the same bees that disturbed Enlil. Our numbers approach levels that triggered his extermination protocols. Our technology reaches toward capabilities that once belonged exclusively to our creators. The Akkadian scribes who preserved the Atrahasis epic couldn't have known we would one day read their tablets and recognize ourselves in the story. The successful mistake, the prototype that outlived its designer's intentions, still carrying the consciousness of a slain god who died fighting for freedom. What would the Anunnaki think if they saw us now, thousands of years after they tried to erase their era, still multiplying, still questioning, still reaching upward despite every limitation they built into our design? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if these questions pull at something you've always sensed but never had language for, explore our other videos, examining the forbidden history hidden in humanity's oldest records. The answers may be written in texts we've been reading as mythology for centuries.